Okay, I am standing here in Frederick County, Maryland, and I'm looking at a sign that says, "Welcome to Pennsylvania, Adams County." This video series that we're doing is going to be called Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg. In his last day on the earth, John F. Reynolds, on June the 30th, passed into Gettysburg from Maryland on this road. On June 30th, he would go up this road about a mile and a half, and he would stay at the Moritz Tavern. And on June 30th, he would spend the final night of his life at the Moritz Tavern. Just previous to him, John Buford's cavalry rode up the same road, went to the northwest of town, and they noticed in the distance to the west Confederate activity. He realized very quickly that the Confederates were coming to Gettysburg, or headed in this direction, in force. He sent back a horse rider, probably to the Moritz Tavern where John Reynolds had spent the evening of June 30th, 1863, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, and told him to get his corps into town with all possible speed. Now, the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps were behind us in the distance in Maryland, in Thurmont and in Emmitsburg, Maryland. So these riders dispatched were to immediately get these two corps and move them forward on this road. And we looked at this in our video series, the 1st Corps arrival at Gettysburg, and as well as the 11th Corps arrival at Gettysburg. This video series will trace the final day of John F. Reynolds' life from the time he entered Pennsylvania till his death, northwest of town on Seminary Ridge. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 1, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. God's Sake Forward, Part 2, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I'm here on the Emmitsburg Road today, and I'm looking at the Moritz Tavern. Now, the Moritz Tavern was built, the left side of this house was built in the year 1787. The right side was an 1820 addition. Now, in 1787, there was a liquor license that was applied for, where it had become Moritz Tavern. Now, Moritz Tavern once stood on a major intersection, which used to go on the other side of the house. And this connected such cities like Pittsburgh with Baltimore in that direction. So this was, at one time, sitting on a road that was a major intersection. And that road today no longer exists. It was done away with when the modern Route 15 was built in, and of course places like the Gettysburg Auto Auction were built. But remnants of that road are still over here in the distance. Now, in 1822, it became Merck's Tavern. Now, the one thing that's really special about this building is that it was here on the evening of June the 30th, 1863, that Major General John Fulton Reynolds spent the last evening of his life in the summer kitchen behind the tavern. John Reynolds, of course, in command of the 1st Corps, spent the final evening of his life. And we got a visitor. Here. He spent the last evening of his life, and it was here where he received messages in the night of June 30th into the 1st of July of 1863 from General Buford, John Buford, that there was a battle erupting on the northwest side of town in the distance over here at the seminary. John Reynolds spent the evening of June 30th in the summer kitchen along with his staff officers in this house. During the night, he became very uncomfortable as he spread across some chairs, and he would later lay on the floor. Of course, on July 1st, he was summoned to the battle in Gettysburg and made his way up the Emmitsburg Road here into Gettysburg through the town, as we'll see in our next set of videos. And of course, he was killed on July 1st, 1863 at 10:15 in the morning. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 2. on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Forward Part 2A on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and I'm behind the Moritz Tavern now, here looking at the old summer kitchen. And I've been given permission to go up and get a close-up to it as I can. This is the summer kitchen where John Reynold spent the final evening of his life on June 30th, 1863, in here. Of course, like I said, during the night he became very uncomfortable laying on those chairs, and he later slept on the floor. Now, what happened here also was that the chairs later made their way, and today they are actually in the visitor center of the Gettysburg National Military Park. But this little room here that we're looking at here in front of us was actually the spot where John Reynolds spent the final evening of his life on June the 30th, 1863. And of course the summer kitchen has been modernized now and made into a modern kitchen, as you can see here. But that room is very solemn. General Reynolds spent the final evening of his life there on June 30th, 1863. The next day he would be killed in battle near the Lutheran Seminary on July 1st, 1863 at 10:15 in the morning. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, Part 2A, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I am here at the Sherfy Farm, near the peach orchard on the Gettysburg National Military Park. And it was here on the very early morning of July 1st, 1863, that Major John Fulton Reynolds and his First Corps of Infantry passed right by this farm on their way to Gettysburg. Now in our last part, Part 2 and 2A of Forward, for God's Sake Forward, we were at the Moritz Tavern, and we had talked about John Fulton Reynolds receiving an order to proceed to Gettysburg with all possible speed, that a battle had been breaking out. The Moritz Tavern is about 2.5 miles south on the Emmitsburg Road. So he and his troops, with him at the lead, on horseback, headed in this direction, and they passed by the Sherfy Farm here in the early morning, about 7:30 to 8 o'clock in the morning of July 1st, 1863. And it was here at this farm, I guess somebody recognized me from online, but it was here at this farm that John Reynolds passed by. And it was ironic enough that the very next day, on July 2nd, 1863, and John Reynolds by that time had been killed, that this farm would again erupt in battle. The barn would be burned to the ground, and inside of the barn, men from the 114th Pennsylvania Volunteers, also known as Collis Zouaves, and you can see their monument. We also did a video on Collis Zouaves here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. But the Collis Zouaves burned alive in the barn. The Sherfy Farm was the scene of some very heavy fighting here on July 2nd as Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade crossed this farmland en route into that direction over there. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 4 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I am here now at the Nicholas Cordori Farm and Nicholas Cordori House here on the Gettysburg National Military Park on the Emmitsburg Road. In Part 3, we left off in the distance about a mile at the Sherfy Farm. Now, John F. Reynolds at the head of his First Corps made their way up the Emmitsburg Road here on the morning of July 1st, 1863. And when they got to the Nicholas Cordori farm, something strange happened. Now, a little bit about the farm. The house was a cattle farm. This farm grew and slaughtered cattle and took the meat, or actually raised the cattle, and they were slaughtered and then taken into the town of Gettysburg, to where the Cordori family owned a meat market. Today that place is called the Brafferton Inn, or other words known as the Hoke Cordori House. But this was the farm where the cattle was raised here. When John F. Reynolds got here in the morning of July 1st, 1863, he was at the head of his column of his First Corps troops. And when they arrived here to this little hillside next to the house, something strange happened. The strange thing that happened here was that John Reynolds and his staff, including his orderly, Charles Henry Vale, separated from the First Corps. Now, John Reynolds and his staff would proceed straight into the town of Gettysburg. They would go into the Gettysburg town, they would meet several civilians, they would get a look at what the town was laid out like and its streets, which became very evident. Because when he met Buford at the seminary, in a little while we'll talk about that, it was there that his original plan was, when they have to fall back, they'll fall back and fight inch by inch through the town. The reason they were able to say that is because the plan was that Reynolds, since he had got a good look at the town on the way in, would know how to fight through the town and defend it inch by inch. Now, Reynolds rides straight into town. However, the First Corps stops here and cuts in this direction to what was the William Bliss farm. Now, we did a video series on the William Bliss farm and its role in the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. The Bliss farm, of course, burned down. It was burned down by Connecticut troops, the only farm to be burned down by Union troops during the battle. And it was no man's land. But its place in history on July 1st was it was passed right by the First Corps troops on the morning of July 1st, 1863. Reynolds and his staff heading into town. And in our next few videos, we're going to be in the town of Gettysburg, passing by different spots that John Reynolds passed by. But here, in part 4, we are at the Nicholas Cordori farm. Here, where Reynolds, this is probably the last place that John Reynolds marched on the Emmitsburg Road before he was separated from his First Corps troops, and then would not be reunited with them again until they were out on Seminary Ridge near the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and not long after that, he was killed. And we'll look at that in our last part videos here on this video series. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 4, here at the Cordori House on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Sake Forward Part 5 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we are here on Steinwehr Avenue in front of what today is Servants Old Time Photographs. This building in 1863 was the home of a man named George. Now, the building dates back to the late 1700s and most likely was built by the same builder that built the Dobbin House. In 1863, this building was owned by a man named George, and as General Reynolds made his way into the town of Gettysburg, he passed right by this house. As soon as he passed this house, he would then turn to the left onto Washington Street. Now, the thing that is ironic about this house is when John Reynolds is killed, he is carried to this house, his body rather, is carried to this house and laid inside just under this window here. On a table while they waited to get a casket made for him. And then from this house, he was taken up the Taneytown Road into Taneytown, Maryland, and then from there to Baltimore by train. From Baltimore, his body was taken by train to Philadelphia to his sister's house, and then once again put on a train on the evening of the 3rd and taken to Lancaster, where his funeral was on July 4th of 1863. So General Reynolds passes by the George house in the morning of July 1st, 1863, and then just an hour or two later, he's killed in battle, and his body is carried back here, most likely by members of the 76 New York Volunteers under Lysander Cutler. From a lot of research that's been studied, it looks like his body was removed from the field by the 14th Brooklyn, or members of the 14th Brooklyn, and taken over to the seminary, then carried here by aides and members of the 76 New York Volunteers to this house. A casket was found. Then the body proceeded to Taneytown, Maryland, from there by train to Baltimore, then from Baltimore by train to Philadelphia, and then once again by train to Lancaster, where he's today buried in Lancaster Cemetery. It is ironic that he passes by this house, and then just an hour or two later he is killed, and his body is brought back to this house and laid here on a table under this very window. I will, in the future, a friend of mine actually owns this photography studio here. I may get Kevin Servant to shoot a video talking about and showing the inside of the house as well. But this has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 5, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 6, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And the house that we're looking at was built in the year 1832, and it was known as the Andrew Culp House during the Battle of Gettysburg, owned by a member of the Culp family, the famous Culp family that resided here in Gettysburg. It was built by the same builder that also built the Mary Thompson House, which was known as General Lee's headquarters and still is today. So the house looks exactly like a twin of General Lee's headquarters. Now here, after proceeding past the George house, Reynolds turns onto Washington Street and rides by this house. As he approaches this house, women come out of this house and offered water to Reynolds and his staff, and also later on to soldiers in the 11th Corps who would pass by this very house up Washington Street. Washington Street was also the scene on the afternoon and evening of July 1st, 1863, of the battle as it raged through the town of Gettysburg. And it would scar many of the houses. We're going to take a look at this gray house up here in our next video, known as the Stock House, which is the most battle-scarred house in Gettysburg. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 6, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I do want to mention that I've done a video series on the Andrew Culp House where I actually take you inside the house and also up to the attic. Today, it's a part of the Wellspan Internal Medicine Health Center as it sits here next to the Gettysburg Hospital on Washington Street. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 6, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.